briefly. So what are the PFAS substances? I think the important thing is we're not talking about 1 or 2 or 3 chemicals. We're talking about, the numbers vary. There are 4,700 that have CAS numbers. There are maybe as many as 7,000. More keep being made almost all the time. And then we also have degradation products that are occurring, for example, from the polymers, and there are many that are unknown. The reason that we have the PFAS is because of the properties that they have, which is their resistance to grease, both water and oil, so that they've been used extensively. And I used to think that they were only used for the last 40 years, but in fact, they've really been used for more like the last 60 years as surfactants and stain repellents. And one of the greatest contamination that we're finding, greatest sources of contamination, is their widespread use in AFFF that has been used to fight fires. There have been some advances made there that I'll mention. Much of the problem with the PFAS is many of them are persistent and bioaccumulative, and many of those which are not bioaccumulative appear to be highly mobile as well. We're finding them all over. They're not restricted to where they are produced or used, but we're finding them in the Arctic, for example. There's been a move in certain countries to move towards what are called the short-chain alternatives. And this is really a very confusing term because the move has been to move away from the things like PFOS and PFOA to things that have fewer carbons, but they still have that carbon-fluorine bond, which is so strong that it basically almost never occurs in nature. And if it does occur, there's really no way to readily break it down. The PFAS, how are we all exposed to PFAS? Well, there are no natural PFAS, which was an issue that we dealt with some of the brominated compounds in the past, that there were naturally occurring ones, but they are produced by industry. And some of them just get into the environment because we have an unfortunate tradition of just dumping things. I've mentioned the air firefighting foam, the AFFF, which also leads to general environmental contamination and presence in the waste. And then we have a tremendous use of this in consumer products, which again, they can be used in a wide variety, from carpet and fabric and food and paper, all kinds of food paper. And when I'm saying this, you should immediately be thinking, how am I being exposed? In our pots and pans, in our clothing, in our cardboard packaging, and I could go on, even in your dental floss and many other sources. And again, this leads to environmental contamination in many sources, and it's leading to human exposure. Much of the focus has been on drinking water exposure, but there's also lots of exposure that can occur, for example, from foods, both from the food packaging, both from where the food is grown, and for example, fish are a major source, and from, for example, how you cook your food. And then we understand that we don't, certainly as a woman, we happily pass this on to our infant, both before they're born and through their breast milk. So we actually find that some of the highest levels are often present in the youngest members of our population. Now, we all have PFAS in our body. This is just some data. This is based on US data, but it's really true all over the world that humans are globally exposed. At least in the US, more than 98% of the people have measurable amounts of PFAS. In the CDC monitoring program, the NIEHS, which is done every 2 years, what you can see on the top is how, with some of the decrease in production of the PFOA and the PFOS that occurred first in PFOS in 2002 and then in PFOA by 2013, what you can see is the levels starting to come down in the population. But I might suggest that if you look at the last two surveys, what you find is that it's starting to plateau out. And what we're starting to see is what we now very well see with PCBs is this is probably because there's so much recirculation going on in the environment that we will have continued exposure as well. And then if you look at some of the other PFAS that were less used but are still out there, again, you really see almost no change in them because they continue to be made, such as the C10, the PFDA, and PFHXS. And I should say PFHXS is extremely interesting to me because This has the longest half-life in the human body of any of the chemicals that have been looked at. PFOS is roughly like 2 years, PFAS about 4 years, and PFHXS, according to data from Sweden, has a half-life of about 10 years in our body. So there's a wide range of health effects, and I guess maybe that's part of the reason that we all care. This is kind of your laundry list, and I'm not going to go through it all, but just know that there's cancers, there's inflammatory disorders and immune system disorders. There's multiple impacts on various hormone systems, not only the thyroid. There are problems in our liver. They're predisposes to obesity, for example. And yet, if there's elevated levels in the mother before birth, the baby is often small for gestational age when they're born. We're seeing impacts on reproductive functions, such as delays in puberty, and we are seeing increases or decreases, rather, in bone density. So most of these effects have been seen in experimental animal models, as well as in our observational human studies. So some of the key questions, and I've already alluded to this, is we have the replacements, what are called the short chains, that are being promoted as safer replacements for PFOS and PFOA. As far as environmental persistence, they are all forever chemicals. I've already mentioned the strength of the carbon-fluorine bond and the difficulty in breaking that down. Some of the shorter chains have less acute toxicity, but in fact may not have a difference when we have chronic exposure or if we are exposed to higher concentrations. There is growing limited evidence showing that they are all well taken up into our body. Now, I'm not talking about the polymers, which are not well taken up, and the target organs are a whole nother issue that whether they're going to the same target organs or not, we have very, very limited data. I should say that there's a very interesting study that was done in Spain about 7 years ago, looking at autopsy specimens, and they found very high levels of some of the short chain ones in the lungs, in the brain, and in the bone. And that really has not been looked at all. And then when we talk about the replacements and are they safer, I can tell you that while you can filter out some of the legacy compounds like PFOS and PFOA with granular activated charcoal, that doesn't work as well when you get, for example, to the short chain ones, although there are other ways that you can remove them.
4 minutes.
So if we talk about the effects of some of the short chain, I'm just going to give you one kind of, as I'm still a nerdy scientist, and I just a little example of some of the data that exists that shows you that some of the short chains, and these are the fluorotelomeric acids and sulfonic acids, these do exactly what PFOA and PFAS do, for example, in the livers in mice. The NTP recently released studies where they looked at 7 different PFAS, and several of them were the short chains. So you've got the PFBS, which is the penta, and you've got the PFHXA acid, which has 6 carbons. And this did exactly what PFOS and again PFOA did in increasing liver weights and the enzymes that cause the liver lesions. And then recent study that came out of Sue Fenton's group showed that Gen-X, which is one that has caused great consternation in my state of North Carolina, as well as issues, for example, where it's also produced in the Netherlands, introduced a similar constellation of adverse maternal liver alterations as the PFOA, and actually they found these effects at a 10-fold lower liver concentration than they did with PFOA. So again, we have no data that says these chemicals don't do the same kind of thing. So there are a number of US federal advisories that are related to PFAS. There is essentially no federal regulation or very limited to date of PFAS. EPA is supposed to, by June 22nd, actually have come out and propose regulatory levels for PFOA and PFOS, which our understanding is that they're going to be the same as the lifetime health advisories that were released about 3 years ago. Hold on, let me just shut this off. There is no regulation for the levels in groundwater, and there is no determination of a hazardous substance, which would put it under the Superfund cleanup opportunities, put it that way. FDA, that there are at least 31 different PFAS that can still be used in food contact material, although 7 of the kind of legacy longer chain PFAS are no longer approved by FDA for use in food contact material. But there are really no limits of what is just in your food as a contaminant. Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is affiliated with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and they released a draft risk assessment for PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHXS. PFNA is the 9-carbon one. And their minimal risk levels, which again are not regulatory levels, they are advisory levels, were as low as 14 parts per, would be the equivalent of 14 parts per trillion in drinking water, so you can see at least 5 times lower than EPA's level. This draft was released 2 years ago. It has been held up in the Office of Management and Budget. The Department of Defense actually, I think, deserves credit for about 2 years ago, actually committing to not using any PFAS in their AFFF for practice and training, but at this point they are still claiming that no AFFF without PFAS will meet their minimal specifications for an actual fire, especially on a ship. And the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which regulates chemical furniture and other products, it doesn't regulate the chemicals, can regulate the levels in products using a class approach, and that came out of encouragement from a report done by the National Academies.
One more minute, Linda.
The states actually have acceptable levels. Some of them some are actually regulatory, and this is not a complete list. I think that some of them are looking at as many as 5 at a time, as for example in Vermont. The Stockholm Convention added PFOS and PFOA, which restricts the use of these to acceptable purposes, and at some point we should say, how does that jibe with essential? And the European Food Safety Authority just had a draft that comments just closed on that about 2 weeks ago, where they actually are proposing regulations that would be the equivalent of about 4 PPT in drinking water for the same 4 PFAS that ATSGR was looking at. So conclusion is that we are all exposed to PFAS. All the PFAS tests are toxic. There are too many PFAS to do proper toxicity testing, and that's including doing some mixtures. The class approach has been endorsed by the National Academy of Sciences, and that we've used it before, and that's something, it's not something that hasn't been heard of. For example, that's how PCBs and dioxins and benzidine-based dyes and others are regulated. The PFAS are all likely to be persistent, and I should have said bioaccumulative and or mobile, or both on a life cycle basis. So we therefore need to prevent new problems or worsening existing problems by eliminating non-essential uses. The limits for the existing PFAS contamination and remediation is much more difficult. I know of no way that you can clean up an entire river system. We need to think about reasonable grouping strategies and read across, rapid screening methods, and possibly some simple mixture models. And I just want to say, why are we continuing to make chemicals that will never go away? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda.